Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of Ask GN. If you have questions for next week's episode, post them in the... Gosh, she's fine. She landed on her feet. Comment section below, and we will address those as best we can, as usual. I normally can't get to all of them, so if I didn't get to it, I'm sorry. I try posting it again. I don't know. I guess we didn't pay her enough for this video, so she's out of here. First thing is not a question, but a comment, or well, a package from NZXT, who have decided to send yet another thing our way for another occasion. Now, last time, you remember that their package was one of their pucks, or two of their pucks, because I had commented on not being particularly fond of the puck on the S340 Elite, which they were very impressed by when they created. So they've sent us another package. We're going to go ahead and see what this is. And just include that in the Ask GN, since there's really no other place to put it. What is that? That's an M&M. It's full of M&Ms. They're NZXT M&Ms. They're NZXT colors. And they're just laying loosely in the package, so I'm not sure they're really safe to eat. Kale management puck. And... Oh, it was in a bag. NZXT, whoever packed this, oh no, don't eat the M&Ms. It says, Happy Valentine's Day, Steve. Heart, NZXT. Let's puck. Very funny. Very funny, Ivan. And this one, is it pink? No, it is just a black puck. So now we've got more. We have two pucks on the wall to my right, underneath the shelf. I think there's one on a fridge somewhere. And now we've got another one. And a bunch of M&Ms that have words on them that I can't read. So that's what NZXT's got for us for this week anyway. I'm assuming this is going to become an ongoing thing. Just the other day, I had a reader email me and say, Steve, NZXT keeps sending me spare screws to my house. It was because of a glitch in their customer service system. Can you please tell them to stop? I forwarded the email to NZXT and said, hey guys, just a heads up. And they said, no problem. We will forward all of these to Gamers Nexus headquarters from now on. So this is now the thing we are doing. I guess we've begun a war with NZXT. First question is from Gibson DK, who says, hey GN, great content as always. I have a question about radiator placement. I have my Corsair H60 front mounted with push-pull fans. Seems logical that cold air to the rad would be best, but I see a lot of people mounting their rads to the top or rear and exhaust. Do you have a preference, and does it make a difference either way to worry about it? The short answer is no, not really. There's not a big difference either way. Let's pause and get her off of the test bench. Well, the short answer to the question is it doesn't matter a whole lot because CPU performance is already pretty good under liquid anyway, even if it's a cheap liquid cooler. This isn't an air versus liquid discussion. This is just, if your CPU is under a decent cooler and has performance that's not in the 90s, you're not going to be limited in terms of frequency or anything like that. Now, of course, you want lower temperatures just as a general rule, but I wouldn't worry about performance. What you can think about is if you're doing things like CPU intensive tasks where it's burning the CPU 100% of the time or a lot of the time, that's then dumping that heat into the case. If you're running a hotter video card like a reference design card in a case with poor ventilation anyway, then you could actually start entering that territory where the GPU temperature increases to a point where either its fans get louder to compensate or you start losing out on boost functionality, whether that's AMD or NVIDIA. That is a possibility. It's not common, but we've definitely seen it, and in at least one or two case reviews, we've talked about it happening where the CPU cooler front mounted would potentially drive your GPU thermals up. That's the only real concern there. In terms of my preferences, I like the tubes oriented down because that's how they should be installed with pretty much any liquid cooler. So if you see a radiator installed front mounted with the tubes at the top, that's not ideal because when that is the configuration, you risk air being sucked through that water tank. So at the top of the radiator and at the bottom, assuming a vertical orientation, those are tanks. And the one that the tubes are connected to specifically, you want the pressure to be put on the tubes so that there's no air in that tank at all, not at the top where it would naturally rest. Because what can happen, especially over time with permeation, is that air will get sucked through the tubes into the pump and cause a gurgling noise, which is just kind of annoying. Not necessarily dangerous. There's a lot of air, it's dangerous, but mostly just annoying in terms of what it sounds like. So I prefer tubes on the bottom orientation, and then for where I mount the cooler, honestly, I normally just throw it in the back if it's for the CPU, because the temperatures at that point, you're fighting over a couple degrees max anyway. So it's kind of like, what does it really matter? Just put it where it looks best and where it's not going to impact temperatures of other components. There are definitely arguments to be made for different orientations and positions for specific cases, but I think we've made most of those in those individual case reviews. For the most part, doesn't matter a whole lot, but I do prefer not to dirty the air coming into the GPU if possible, just because normally the GPU is where you're going to be limited. Yeah, again, especially if it's at the top front of the case, all that air is going to go over the GPU anyway. So next question is, Dino says, cooling question. I have a Corsair H110i GTX. I have it set up in my case with a push-pull setup, but I have it in an intake at the top. I know most people would use this as an exhaust. My question is, how much, if any, does it matter? For good measure, I have two Corsair SP140 fans running as intake from the front, AF140 fan in the back as exhaust, 950 FTW. I didn't even know they made 950 FTWs. And I'm cooling a 5820K at 4.5 gigahertz. So what was I have it set up in my case with a push-pull intake at the top. Yeah, so this is something I've tested. The thing here is, for the most part, when you have, let's talk about tower coolers first, like the traditional block of aluminum on a CPU. The way those work, if you have top exhaust in several of the cases we've tested, including the Kublai KL04, with exhaust in the wrong position at the top, you can actually end up choking the CPU for air, increasing its temperature. For example, if you have exhaust in the top front, meaning towards the front of the case, but in the top as exhaust, and you have front intake, it's going to pull that air straight out of the case. It'll never touch a component, especially if the top fan is too powerful. You want that top fan to be either less powerful or just not there, which is normally how I do it. So if you orient it that way, you can actually steal air from the CPU, which the point of saying that is, if you have it configured as top intake, that's fine. Again, now I know people say hot air rises, and it does, but the molecular energy, the molecular movement at 25C versus at 0C is an extra 4% or so. And in a use case where we're talking computer components, it doesn't matter. Again, the hot air rises thing matters a whole lot less than air pressure and then how many fans you have where. Again, front fan intake versus top fan exhaust right next to it. What matters more is that this fan is pulling air away from the cooler before it ever gets there, not that hot air rises, because cold air also rises when you're sucking it through a fan. So that's something to keep in mind. So the reason, again, if that's your setup, it's probably fine. The only reason that would really be a concern is if the case is choked for airflow elsewhere. Of course, you have the dust topic to talk about, where you're now risking pulling dust in through the top, and that's sometimes not as easy to deal with as in the front, where there are all these filters and things to stop that from ever getting to the system. The top is normally more porous. That's really the main argument. Push-pull also, there's not a whole lot of benefit from, for the most part. There are use cases, of course, but that's another one of those, you're fighting over a degree or two a lot of the time, and that's not super relevant for the most part. So yeah, the answer is, doesn't really matter. If you like it there, leave it there, especially because if the GPU's under control anyway, and if you have a rear exhaust, then you're not really at risk of warming up the backplate, which is not a sensitive part of the GPU to begin with. Next question, Crimson Sunrise says, since cooling is your specialty, does rigid tubing make any difference temperature-wise in a water cooling loop, or is the difference purely cosmetic? So speaking strictly to AIOs, it's pretty much the same, but the difference in tubing material is more to do with permeation than it is to do with really anything else. So your typical materials, Asus uses that sort of rubberized. If you look at any of the Kraken series coolers or some of the Corsair coolers, they have that rubberized exterior. It might be braided. That is one type of material. Then there's also the PET materials, for example, on the Fury X. So the Fury X, if you know that one, it's got the radiator with the rigid tubing coming out of it, and that's PET. PET has a Teflon coating inside of it, and that Teflon coating can crack if you bend the tube in a way that it doesn't like. So Asus tubing, you can bend it to a point where it'll just kink the flow of the liquid, and that's not great. Obviously, it's you're not going to cool anything that way, but it's not going to crack the coating. With the PET tubing, the performance is more or less the same as far as we've seen temperature-wise, but if you bend that tube too far, even without knowing it, you could crack the inner Teflon lining inside of the tube, and when that happens, the liquid in the tube can start to effectively leak out of the Teflon-coated area, and you start having loss of fluid within the loop. So normally permeation is the problem. With the Asus coolers, the temperature limit for the liquid tends to be 60 Celsius, I think. Off the top of my head, it might be 65, but I'm pretty damn sure it's 60. So if your liquid temperature, not your CPU, your liquid temperature exceeds 60, that starts to enter territory where there can be permeation of the tubes, and you lose liquid, and when you lose liquid, it means the thing is going to start dying eventually because, as I was saying a second ago, the pump will just start pulling air through the system because there's nothing else to pull through it, and that's bad for everything, especially cooling. That liquid, you can't really liquid cool very well. So temperature difference, not huge. Price difference to make, I'm sure there is one. I don't know the cost off the top of my head. Longevity, it's just a matter of technically PET tubing with a Teflon coating, you would think would hold that liquid for longer than the rubber material that permeates. Both of them have about the same lifespan expectancy, which is normally 5 years before you should be expecting to maybe start encountering problems with the system, but with the system being the AIO. Hopefully that answers that question to some degree. Next question is from Quetzalcoatl, who says, "Hey Steve, does the thermal paste between the CPU die and the IHS, when it gets older, lower the heat dissipation? I have an old 2500K. It's on 4.4 gigahertz at 1.3 volts from 3 years now. Because the first 2 years it was sitting 4.5 or 1.33. As I remember, the temperatures got higher than my comfort zone for 24/7 OC. I'm using Noctua DHD14. Basically, the question is, he says, I clean my thermal paste every 6 months and clean the cooler every month. That is aggressive, with deep cleaning every 6 months because I change the paste and take it off the board. That's definitely more than you need to do. There is something called curing. So the thermal compound does cure over time. And technically, if you're going to account for this in testing, really start introducing a whole lot more, a new level of control that's not easy to account for. But if you test thermal paste over time and you have an extremely controlled environment, check out the video where I talk about Kyle's testing, Bitwit's testing. If you have an extremely controlled environment, you could maybe plot some degradation in performance over time from the thermal compound curing. This is more of an issue with something like a laptop. We previously did the laptop thermal paste and dust cleaning, and that showed a pretty significant 20 or something Celsius, 20 to 30 Celsius temperature difference. A lot of that was dust. But thermal paste with those electronics, a lot of times it's cheaper paste. It's in really abusive environments, like a laptop where it gets hot and it's a small case, and there might be dust thrown in there too. So in those cases, it actually is a good idea to replace the thermal compound, especially with a laptop, because you're probably using it for something like 4 or 5 years. Replace the compound, you might get more life out of it, or at the least, reduce the amount of effort that the fan has to put in terms of increasing its RPM to deal with the heat. With desktops, it's not really so much of an issue, but if you're running a 2500K and you weren't already doing this every 6 months cleaning thing, I would say now is not a bad time to do that. But test the temperatures first just so you can kind of see for yourself if there's a difference. There shouldn't be much of one, especially if you used a good paste to begin with, but they do cure at different rates. It's not something we've really published results on or tested long term, because for curing tests you would have to run it for a long amount of time. But I know some sites have at least attempted it. I think maybe Puget Systems might have attempted it. I would trust their numbers more than most of the media sites, just because it's their business. But curing's a thing. It's not that big of a problem normally, especially if you don't flood the thing with thermal compound you don't need. Next question, James Stewart says, I've noticed that motherboards are being shipped without VRM heatsinks now. I've been under the impression VRMs need some kind of cooling. Should I be concerned? As when I was speaking with Buildzoid not long ago about one of the 2 motherboards we were working on for review, he mentioned, and it was a good point, that a lot of these things, they put these really beefed up VRM heatsinks on them, but a lot of the time it's for cosmetics, or my perspective of this would be it's for making the user feel like the temperature is going to be under control. Whether or not they test it, or it's just a user feedback thing where it's like, you see the big aluminum heatsink on the VRM and you think that that's good and you're happy about it. I think that's kind of where the start and end of it is. Some VRMs certainly do better with cooling, but as Buildzoid pointed out to me, a lot of the overclockers will pull those things off when they're doing overclocking on the CPU, the heatsinks that is, because they're not necessary. VRMs, again, to recap what we've said over and over, most of them can handle 125 to 150C, no problem. 150C you might start derating. Once you hit 180 Celsius, you might have some kind of flame out, but it's not going to get to 180 Celsius. It probably won't even get to 150 without a heatsink, as long as there's some kind of airflow within the case, because all you really care about is there air going over that area? And if you have a liquid cooler, there is a reduced amount of airflow going over the CPU socket, because you don't have a fan sitting there sucking air through, but as long as you've got a front intake fan, you're probably fine. And as a note, the only time you'd really need to be concerned about if the VRMs are overheating, other than extreme overclocking, is you've bought an exceptionally cheap board, like $30 to $50, and it's priced out of its category, or and it doesn't have a VRM heatsink, or it had a VRM heatsink on it and you've taken it off. Then you should be more inquisitive about the results, the temperature for the VRMs, but normally not really a huge issue now. And also, if you look at some of the VRM heatsink designs lately, a lot of them are just big blocks with no fins. So it's a limited amount of, it's not that effective, because it's just a big block of aluminum that's aluminum straight through is not going to work better than a thinner block that's diced into a ton of fins. That'll always work better because it's more surface area exposed to the air that's wicking the heat. Next question, Lewis Kleiman says, any comments on the possibility of testing CPU and or GPU coolers using controllable heat source rather than trying to control all variables when using a CPU? Yes, we've looked at that a ton in the past. Intel has an engineering CPU that is just a heat generator. It's not a real CPU, and it sits in a fake socket. Most of the temperature companies, Corsair, those types of people would have one of these. We interviewed Bobby Kinstall from Corsair a while ago, and if you watch that video, we show the thing in use, and I can't remember the name of it off the top of my head, but we talk about it in the video. It's an Intel specific sort of CPU analog, like a fake CPU, and they can use that for temperature testing. And that's a really good approach. Now, there are a few concerns here. We've looked into making these. It's not hard to make. You could put something in there to generate a temperature. You use like a K-type thermocouple and embed it in your heatsink or somewhere else within the plate of your fake CPU, and you could read effectively the IHS temperature, what that would be. That would be a good way to build one, and you just generate power in it to create a certain amount of watts of heat. So you can say push 170 watts through it, and that would be equivalent somewhat of 5930K overclocked. The flaw is, there are a few flaws. One is with the frequency. The problem you run into is if we start hitting thermal throttle scenarios, we want to be able to show how does that impact the frequency, and you can't do that with a fake CPU. That's really just a heat generator. So you lose the ability to say this downclocked 200 megahertz because it was hitting 99, 100, 105 Celsius or whatever it may be. So you lose that potential. You lose a lot of logging potential, which is always just nice to have for data presentation. And then the second point is less of a testing issue and less of a concern for content and more of a concern for user perception of the data. Because if you've seen it on videos in the past, well, a lot of them with Jay's 2 cents to be honest, the comments around just using an open air test bench are already a mix of misinformed enough, misguided, and genuine interest in why you would use one platform versus another, the comments on those videos just over open air versus a case are already enough of a challenge to overcome when you're doing tests. And there are valid arguments for both sides of it. Unfortunately, most of the time people presenting the arguments don't know what they're talking about, but such is the way of the internet. So then when you start introducing this new thing where you're saying, actually, we're testing these by doing an analog CPU, what do the comments then look like? People just think they can't even trust the data because they think it's not real world, when in reality, all you care about testing heat sinks, of course, is how to generate heat for the heatsink to sink and dissipate, and how effectively does it do so. So that is normally an intricacy that is lost on general viewers, I think, and perhaps our audience is largely excluded in that. So what you would have to do then is run the analog test, we'll call it, and the real world test, and publish both sets of numbers, and that's just doubling the work without a lot of gain, since we haven't eliminated the control concern. So it seems, in my experience, seems best to just control for the CPU and BIOS and software as best you can, which if you know what you're doing, years of screwing up, it's not too hard. Until that point, it's a big challenge. But I think that mostly answers that question. Next one is Abec Hondatech says, hey Steve, I have a question about VRAM that's bothering me some time. Let's say I have a GTX 1080, but the game uses 4 gigabytes of VRAM. How are these 4 gigabytes allocated? Is it programmed that this 4 gig will be split between all 8 modules, or fill 4 of them to full capacity and have 4 empty? I don't know the exact answer to this, but I'm going to do my best to explain my thinking logically as to what I think the answer is, and I'll send an email out and see if anyone can actually address it, but I don't know if I'll get an answer on something like this. My assumption would be, because of how the programs are addressing the memory and because of how the GPU works at a fundamental level when it's accessing memory, I would assume logically that you would want to put resources in all of the modules, even if you're not using all of them, because then you can leverage all of the bandwidth to those modules rather than being limited by 4 out of 8. Because even if you only have half of your VRAM needed to put all of that data onto just half of the modules, you're limiting the amount of bandwidth you can shuttle down that pipe effectively to the VRAM from the GPU. And I would think that would be an efficiency problem that is unnecessary. So my assumption would be you split it between all the VRAM, and that's largely automated these days. A lot of the memory addressing and register addressing that used to be required isn't such a concern now, especially if you're not writing in assembly or something. But that would be my best guess, and I'll have to ask around and see if I can get a really technical answer, but I don't know that I will. Next question. FloopyFlip says, I have a question about RAM. What's the difference between 1 8 gigabyte versus 2 versus 4 gigabyte versus 2 8 gigabytes? Same speed configuration, effects on gaming and normal usage. We show some of this in an old video that we need to revisit. If you look up multi-channel memory on the channel, or dual channel, probably would find the results on the YouTube channel or articles on the website. The very short of it, there's no such thing as dual channel RAM. People like to say that. It's not real. There is no kit of memory on the market that is specifically made for 2 channels. It's just RAM. The platform can support dual channel or quad channel or whatever, triple channel in some older Nehalem cases. The platform dictates the channeling of the memory in the platform. So if you go buy 2 sticks of memory and you put it in a modern Intel Z series non-X99 platform, that platform supports 2-channel memory max. It will use both of those sticks in dual channel, assuming you've configured it properly in the motherboard. If you buy 4 sticks for that same motherboard, it will still be 2-channel. And if you buy 1 stick, it will be 1 channel. If you buy 3, it'll be single channel also. If you buy an X99 platform, put 4 sticks in it or 8 sticks in it, it'll run quad. So first let's clear that out of the way, the language here. Dual channel memory does not exist. The platform is dual channel, the memory is memory. With that cleared, the question of what's the difference. If you buy a single stick, and let's say the stick is rated at maybe 2133 or something, it won't run at 2133 unless you buy another one. It will run at half of that speed, and that's because it's in single channel. So if you're on 4 gigabytes, you run faster memory, and it's the same capacity. Does it matter? Last time we tested it, no, not really. Now, there is some dependency on the application. There may be use cases in production where it matters more. Anything where you're memory bound, it matters more. As a very specific example, F1 2011 cares a lot more about that than any of the other games that we've tested. Speaking personally, I do prefer to have sticks of memory and multiples of 2, just because it feels like you should, but that doesn't mean it's a good reason to do it. It does mean, however, that you will get the dual channel performance or the maximum frequency in the event that you run into something that cares. Generally, games don't care a whole lot in our testing from a few years ago, and that probably hasn't changed very much for modern day. Hopefully that answers the basics though. What else do we have? Oh yeah, there's, well, we'll adjust that. Oh, this was part of the same question. What happens if you run out of RAM was the question. The very short of it, your drive, solid state or otherwise, will come into play, and the page file will come into play in Windows. So you cache out of memory, you have to start pulling that data from elsewhere, which is normally from storage. And I think I'll probably cut it off there because this is a pretty long video now. So if I didn't get to your questions, post them below. I'll take one more. I'll take the, instead of the usual what's your conditioner question, where I say it's thermal paste, Fran Tastic said, wanted to ask if you have time for gaming at all. I always wondered if creating content for a site or channel targeted at gamers is so time consuming that you either don't have enough time for gaming or you just want to do something completely different in your free time. If you're actually gaming and not just benchmarking, what are your current favorites? Right now, the only game I have any time to play, I can only normally juggle one at a time, and right now that's Planet Coaster, and at best I get 1 to 4 hours a month. So not a whole lot of gaming. All the gaming is basically benchmarking, where it's hours at a time running the same 30-second course in a game. The content creation can be anywhere from some of these days, like finishing that EVGA ICX content, can be 18-hour-long days. So you don't really want to use your remaining however many hours playing games. Not because they're not enjoyable, but because there's other things to do, like sleep, in theory. I do spend a lot of time at these trade shows, like we go to Taipei for Computex, went there last year. I'll take a few days there and go do mountain biking off in the mountains. And this is something where we were talking about spinning off a second channel at some point and talking about like bike repair or mountain bike builds or biking in other countries or trail reviews, things like that. So do a lot of downhill biking in Whistler and Mammoth Mountain, Snowshoe, Bryce Beach, all those places, which is just all chairlift access stuff. And then Taipei was really cool because I was with this guy who was, he spoke, he did not speak very much English. He was my guide for riding the trails there, and I had to do my best to convey to him, like, I can't keep up with you. It's 110 degrees, and I'm from America. Give me a break. But that was a crazy, crazy experience. We went way off into the mountains, and I thought I was going to die because it was 110 degrees. I didn't bring enough food. I didn't have enough water, and he stopped at some tea place and gave me boiling hot tea, which is not what I wanted at the time. So that's really the only thing I do other than gaming is that stuff, building, maintaining, and riding bikes. So there may be a second channel there in the future for that. I guess let us know if you're interested. But that's all for this time. As always, patreon.com/gamersnexus to help us out directly. Subscribe for more. Leave your questions in the comment section below. NZXT, I see this, and I will raise you at some point, but I'm not sure what just yet. I'll see you all next time.